Good morning. Thank you for choosing to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. You know, today is the first day of our new year, 2023. It's kind of hard to believe that just 7 short days ago, we were sitting around a Christmas tree with our friends and our family celebrating. Now, the only memory of those presents that we so carefully chose and wrapped are the discarded boxes and all of the ripped paper that is strewn across the floor or is sitting in a garbage can. I imagine that there are some of you who your home looked remarkably like a Walmart 10 minutes after you started opening the gifts with boxes and bows scattered all over the floor. I can imagine that some of you are still finding little scraps of wrapping paper under a chair or in one of the crevices of a couch. All the gifts have been played with. A few of them, unfortunately, are already broken and have also made their way to the trash can. Others are destined to be put in that box of seldom played with toys. Other gifts have been exchanged for a different size or a different color or even returned for store credit. Those leftovers are starting to turn a funny color. Maybe they're beginning to smell. It's time for you to admit that nobody's going to warm up that asparagus casserole and try that again. Maybe the needles from your Christmas tree are beginning to fall to the floor, making a big mess, or maybe you're realizing there's nothing to look forward to except the credit card bills that'll be coming in the mail very soon. There is some good news because we get to do it all over again in 358 days. Yet it's easy for us to get depressed this time of year. I know it's a new year and this is a time that should be filled with new hope and new possibilities, but really after the past couple years, I think we're much more cautiously optimistic. Christmas is a big deal, and now that we're here on the other side of it, we tend to get this feeling that, I need to be doing something, but there are no gifts to buy, no parties to plan, no arrangements to be made. And even with all the stress and the weariness that comes from the holiday season, it's easy for us to get into January and just to have these post-season blues. I felt it this week. It's tough to get motivated to get back into a regular routine after all of the excitement and anticipation of the last month has finally come and gone. For some of us, the letdown's relatively minor. We just quickly clean up the mess. We put the boxes and paper in the trash can. We just move on to the next item in our calendar. But we need to honestly admit and acknowledge there are people in our family and in our neighborhood that are having a much more difficult time. We all know people who have anticipated being with family and friends. They loved being in the kitchen. They enjoyed the lights and the gifts. And now that Christmas has come and gone, everything just seems and feels so empty. It's easy for them to slip into a little bit of depression. Everybody wants to put the tree up. Nobody wants to take it down. Which might explain why your neighbors still have their Christmas lights up in July. Probably doesn't explain why they still turn them on, but it may explain why they have them up. This morning we're going to close out our series, Merry Christmas from the Family, by looking at a really familiar story out of the Old Testament. I want us to camp out in 1 Kings chapter 19 this morning to spend some time with the prophet Elijah, who's dealing with his own letdown and depression. You see, when we get to our text this morning, Elijah's on the run. The last few days have been really exciting. In chapter 18, he goes to visit the king, King Ahab, and it's not a friendly visit because they're not friends. Actually, when he shows up, Ahab looks at the prophet and says, the troublemaker has decided to finally show his face. You see, for the last 3 years, Israel has been in the middle of a severe drought. For 3 years, it hasn't rained in the land at all. The streams, the creeks, the rivers, they're all drying up. The crops can't produce food. Livestock is dying. And Ahab wants to blame all of that on Elijah, but the prophet only delivered the message. And now he's back. And there's this display of the supremacy and dominance of Jehovah as he exercises his power and authority over 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, along with the king and the queen Jezebel. And even though we're not going to delve into that part of the story this morning, I want you to know that that had been a huge day in the life of Israel. The people had been waiting and longing for the day that the rain would return. And much like a child on Christmas, they're not really sure how all of this is going to work out, how it's all going to happen. But when the clouds began to fill the sky, they rejoiced with this welcome gift. And while the echoes of their excitement and joy are still in the air, that's the very moment that Elijah's struggle began. Maybe back in November, you thought this Christmas was going to be different. And then you kind of got in the mood. You started to make a couple decorations. You did a little baking, and the decorations were really cute, and the baking smelled so good that you decided to make a little more, and then a little more, and a little more, and pretty soon you've got a table in your house just filled with decorations and pies, and you don't know what to do with all of them. You see, success has a way of making us want more success. Pretty soon we're chasing after the success, and we've forgotten why we started in the first place. The feeling of success becomes so exhilarating that we just press on until we hit the wall and we can't go any farther. Elijah had already told Ahab that the rain was going to come again, but we find that he gets up and he runs 20 miles over rough terrain, even outruns the king's chariot to talk to the king some more. And Elijah shows us that the most vulnerable point in our life is right after we've experienced a victory. We come off the mountain, we often go right into the valley where we get unsettled by fear. In chapter 19, the chapter begins by telling us that when Ahab arrived, he tells Jezebel about everything that had taken place. He told her how Elijah had executed all the prophets of Baal with a sword. Personally, I wonder if Ahab was a little excited and amazed at the things that he'd just seen. I mean, he just witnessed God do some pretty miraculous things. I mean, fire actually came down from heaven and consumed not only the sacrifice, but the altar as well. There's no way you just explain something like that away as a coincidence. Jezebel doesn't have the same reaction, the same experience. She doesn't hear the people singing and worshiping. Instead, she flies into this rage and she sends a message to Elijah and says, the gods will get you for this and I'll get even with you. By this time tomorrow, you will be as dead as every one of those prophets. At that moment, Elijah should have been bent over with a belly laugh because just a few moments ago, Jezebel's false gods were exposed. She has no power to do really anything. But Elijah doesn't laugh. Instead, he runs for his life. Fear replaces his faith as he shifts his focus from God to what's going on around him. This past week, I was in a grocery store and I was eavesdropping. And I was listening to two older women having this conversation. And one of the women was talking about how her whole family had come and sat around her table for Christmas. She talked about how much she enjoyed watching her grandkids open the gifts that her and her husband had bought for them. And the story was really sweet. Actually, as I was listening to the story, I was reminded of the Christmases that I was able to spend at my grandparents' home. But then her story took a hard left turn when she said, I really hope my family enjoyed it because, well, the way the economy's going, I doubt we'll be able to do anything like that ever again. What an awful way to end such a beautiful story. Instead of having this wonderful memory of the time that she's in her house and she's surrounded by her kids and her grandkids, she's looking forward to something 12 months down the road and wondering, where's the money going to come from? How are we going to be able to afford that? And the truth is, a year is a long time. We don't have the ability to know what's going to happen next week, much less next year. But unfortunately, so many of us look down the road at the unknown and we await the worst of times instead of trusting the one who designed time to begin with. We become so comfortable with our fear that we not only lose sight of God, we lose sight of the people that He places in our life to bless us. Elijah's running for his life. Instead of standing up to Jezebel, he's running away. In the last 3 years, God has taken care of him over and over again. The last few days, there's been no doubt of God's amazing power, but yet here's Elijah stuck in this emotional overdrive, exhausted, anxious, and running on empty. The last few weeks of his life, the last few weeks of our life, There's been so much anticipation and excitement because of who's coming home for the holidays. Our parents, our children, our grandchildren, our brothers, our sisters, all gathered together to celebrate the season. But it's like as soon as the turkey got lukewarm, it was time for folks to go home. A house that was full of laughter and joy a couple hours ago is now silent and empty. And it's not just that the house feels empty. We tend to feel empty as well. That joy that we had sitting around the table laughing and telling stories has been replaced with this cold, lonely feeling. One of the great dangers of depression is the tendency for us to turn inward into self-focus. Pick up in verse 3. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judea, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died." Elijah's reached the end of his rope. A few hours ago, he was okay. But now he's done. A few moments ago, he was caught up in all the things that God was doing, and now he's isolated himself, and he feels like he's in this impossible situation. And whether we're willing to admit it or not, we all have a little Elijah in us. When we're hurting, we tend to withdraw from other people instead of reaching out. We close ourselves off, and then we wonder, why do we feel so alone? I understand that this hasn't been your normal Christmas series, but the truth is, not every Christmas is normal. I'm aware that the events over the last few years have caused some of us to walk through some pretty dark valleys. And in those moments, we tend to compound our struggles because we just don't want to bother anybody. So we just continue to fight by ourselves, which makes everything worse. The next thing you know, we feel hopeless. And we're considering giving up. After all, we're empty. We don't have anything else to give. I mean, we tried to do the right thing. We decorated, we cooked, we cleaned, we baked. We didn't feel like doing it. But, the family was counting on us, and we didn't want to let them down. And this might be the only chance we get to see them. And the next thing you know, we find ourselves struggling with these post-season blues. I mean, I want to be excited about what's going to happen next, but we're just so tired and emotionally drained, and at best we can just tread water. That's where we find Elijah. In chapter 19, he goes as far south as he can go, and then he leaves his servant and he runs for another day deeper into the desert. He's exhausted to the point that all of the gauges of his life, emotionally, spiritually, physically, relationally, everything's on empty. I mean, if one of those areas of your life start flashing empty, you're in trouble. But all four at the same time, you end up getting in this spiral that just keeps getting worse. Completely exhausted, Elijah isolates himself even more. He collapses under a small bush and he says, "God, just let me die." I think we understand the tendency to withdraw when things get stressful and difficult. We start to feel a little sad, maybe we're a little depressed, and we isolate ourselves. And the more we isolate ourselves, the more despair we feel. And the more despair we feel, the more we isolate ourselves. And the more we isolate ourselves, the more despair we feel. And just like Elijah, we get into this spiral until we just say, "God, I've had enough." You and I were created to live in community. Do you remember that when God looked into the garden, that he saw everything that he created and he said, everything is good? Almost. There was one thing that God said wasn't good. He said, it's not good for man to be alone. We weren't created to live in isolation. Last year, the October issue of Christianity Today had this article written by Dr. Tyler Vanderweel. It's entitled, "The Public Health Crisis That No One's Talking About." Dr. Vanderweel is a medical professor at Harvard, and he spent over the last decade researching about how being a part of a gathering, regularly committed to a community of faith, how that impacts our life, specifically healthcare workers. And his research was fascinating, especially in the light of what we learned about community during the height of COVID. I want to share a little bit of that article with you this morning. He writes, medical workers who said they attended religious services frequently were 29% less likely to become depressed, about 50% less likely to divorce, and 5 times less likely to commit suicide than those who never attended. And then perhaps the most striking finding of all, healthcare professionals who attended services weekly were 33% less likely to die during a 16-year follow-up period than people who never attended. Guys, that's pretty definitive research. And he goes on, he doesn't just talk about medical professionals, he talks about everybody in his research, because he goes on to say that a religious upbringing also profoundly affects lifelong health and well-being. We found regular service attendance helps shield children from the big 3 dangers of adolescence: depression, substance abuse, and premature sexual activity. People who attend church as children are also more likely to grow up happy, to be forgiving, to have a sense of mission and purpose, and to volunteer. Regular church attenders had far fewer deaths of despair, deaths by suicide, drug overdose, or alcohol, than people who never attended services, reducing those deaths by 68% for women and 33% for men. Maybe God knew what he was doing. Maybe God really understood what we needed when he put us in a community with one another. Elijah needed other people. He makes the horrible choice to isolate himself. And the more he isolates himself, the more he was willing to believe the lie that no one else can understand what he's going through. The truth is, we need one another, but often we start feeling this despair and we isolate ourselves. We tell ourselves, it's not that big a deal. We can work our way out of this. Or we believe, nobody would really understand anyway. Or worse, we think if people understood or thought that we were depressed, they'd think we were weak. So we put on a brave face, we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and we suffer in silence. I need you to hear me say today, you're not alone. It was God's intention for you to be a part of a community of faith that will encourage you, support you, and walk with you in times of sadness and discouragement. I think one of the biggest problems that we have is a lot of us were forced to stay home because of COVID. Churches were closed down, and it became all too easy to just watch a sermon on TV or online and think, I'm a part of that church family, or that I've been to worship. Watching a sermon is not being a part of a community of faith. It actually just keeps you living in isolation away from God. We're recognizing more and more every day that God was right. It's not good for a man or a woman to be alone. Which means that if you're dealing with some post-season blues, you have to make the decision to be committed to a community of faith. To find a community of faith to join. Don't be content to just watch a sermon or a worship service online. You need to be actively involved in a family of faith. You're not bothering or burdening anyone by saying, I need a little help. By saying, I need somebody to come alongside me, to help me, to pray for me, to remind me that God has done everything that allows me to know him and to know his love and his welcome. You see, there's one more passage to the story today. Let's skip down to verse 15. We read, God said, go back the way you came through the desert to Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, make him king over Aram. Then anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, and make him king over Israel. Finally, anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, from Abel Manoah, to succeed you as prophet. God allows Elijah to rest. He feeds him. He takes him up to the mountain where he allows him to experience his presence and the calm. But God says, Elijah, I have one more thing for you to do. It's important. I want you to find somebody for you to walk with. Go and invite Elisha to join you and pour into that relationship. Don't isolate yourself. Invite someone to partner with you. Don't withdraw. I want you to be in a relationship with someone else, someone who will encourage you and someone who will walk with you in your moment of despair because your soul depends on it. As you go to the table this morning, I want you to take some time to be honest about your emotional well-being. It's okay to have some post-season blues, but it's never okay to isolate yourself believing that nobody cares. We are the body of Christ. We are called to care for one another. We are called to walk with one another. We are called to love one another. You see, Elijah's cure was found in relationships. Relationships with Elisha and, on a deeper level, a relationship with God. The post-season blues, the depression that you feel, maybe that is a cry of your soul to say, I need some real relationships. I need to have relationships with people that love me and care about me. And I need, on a much deeper level, to have a relationship with God. The one who loves me, who redeemed me, and who is waiting to take me home with him. I hope and I pray that this year will be a wonderful year for you. Maybe a year that started with post-season blues will bloom and blossom into an opportunity for you to have deep, lasting relationships where you can pour into people, where people can pour into you, where you can find true community with people of faith, people that love God and love you. I hope you have a wonderful week. Never forget how deeply you're loved. I look forward to seeing you very soon.